Was it a mistake or was it malice? The Chinese Communist response to the outbreak of COVID-19. President Trump was asked that, addressed it at last night's Fox News town hall.
So I think they made a horrible mistake, and they didn't want to admit it. We wanted to go in. They didn't want us there. Even World Health wanted to go in. They were admitted, but much later, not immediately. And my opinion is they made a mistake. They tried to cover it. They tried to put it out. It's like a fire. It's really like trying to put out a fire. They couldn't put out the fire. What they really treated the world badly on, they stopped people going into China, but they didn't stop people going into the USA and all over the world. So you could fly out of Wuhan, where the primary problem was, all of the problem, essentially, also where the lab is. But you could fly out of Wuhan and you could go to different parts of the world, but you couldn't go to Beijing and you couldn't go to any place in China. So what's that all about? In other words, they knew they had a problem. I think they were embarrassed by the problem, very embarrassed. And the case could be made. They said, hey, look, this is going to have a huge impact on China, and we might as well let the rest of the world.
And Department of Homeland Security has put together an intelligence report that reporters at Politico apparently got a look at, which contends, among other things, that it withheld information about the severity of the viral outbreak so it would have time to hoard medical supplies. According to the intelligence report, China increased its imports of surgical face masks by 278%. This is in January. Increased its imports of surgical face masks by 278%, surgical gowns by 72%, surgical gloves by 32%. Meanwhile, slashing its exports of a host of medical products, surgical gloves, surgical gowns, face masks, medical ventilators, intubator kits, thermometers, and cotton balls and swabs. Evidence of guilt and a recognition of what was happening. Why don't we just start there? For more on this, let's be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation, author of books including Wiki at War and Private Sector Public Wars. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, it's good to be with you.
Does Trump have that more or less correct?
Well, we don't know. I mean, I was in the Army for 25 years, and I've been dealing with intelligence and intelligence matters for, many, many, many decades. And I know how this works. I'm sure what the president is publicly stating reflects kind of the contemporary understanding in the intelligence community. But we have to recognize, we don't know what's underneath that, how fragmentary that is, how that information was really compiled. Stuff's called sources and methods. And this is important because what we're really getting at, other than the kind of the one factual question, which is there's now some suggestion that possibly came out of a lab and somebody inadvertently brought it out of the lab and got it into the public, and that's how the disease spread. Other than that factual question, which I don't know if we actually have a definitive answer to yet, the other questions are really about matters of intent. Why? We know that the Chinese did, but why did they did what they did? So, I mean, there were two big questions there. One is that they knew this thing was unbelievably devastating, and they said, well, let's just let it go worldwide, and everybody will suffer just like we are. That's one question. And the other is, we know this thing's absolutely terribly devastating. Let's not tell anybody until we've stockpiled all our medical supplies and we take care of ourselves first. We don't know those are hard questions to answer. Rarely do you actually have a smoking gun. But what people have to realize is we're collecting all kinds of intelligence, messages going back and forth between embassies, messages between officials, all kinds of things. So, I think the jury, in a sense, is really kind of still out on the intent questions, at least publicly. And it may be some time before all that gets answered, certainly sometime before the underlying intelligence that's available becomes publicly available.
Well, but go Dan.
Well, I mean, so the mens rea here with respect to the Chinese communists, I'm having a difficult time following you. You're saying that we don't know if they did anything purposeful with respect to combating, or more to the point, not combating, informing or not informing the rest of the world?
So we know that they did not inform the rest of the world. That's factual. There's a requirement for reporting under the international health regulations that they violated those, and they violated them not like missing the deadline by 24 hours, but in weeks. So it's very, very clear that in delaying telling the rest of the world how communicable this disease was, they essentially nobody else had really had time to prepare for the pandemic. So we know they did that. We also know that they let tens of thousands of people travel when they knew the disease was highly communicable, and they knew that some of them could have been infected. We know that they did that. Now, why did that happen? Was that stupid bureaucracy? Was that just they were embarrassed by it? Was it an intentional act of spreading the disease? I don't think, at least publicly, we have the information to decisively answer those questions.
Although if those numbers check out about what they were doing in January with respect to imports and exports of PPE, that certainly is strong circumstantial evidence of malice.
Right, and I think that's the point, is we have really very powerful circumstantial evidence of malice. That's fair. But we don't have a smoking gun. On the other hand, I'm not in the let's be soft on China camp. China isn't involved here, because they're absolutely involved here, because they committed two actions which absolutely ensured that this would be a global pandemic and that hundreds of thousands of people would die. One is they let people leave the country when they knew they were likely contagious, and the other was they denied critical information to the rest of the world that would have enabled the rest of the world to prepare for the disease, and they might not have had the pandemics break out in their country, including not providing live virus samples of the original strain of the disease. They still haven't done that, and that is really, really important, because obviously we can all go get samples of the virus now. That's not a problem. But you want to be able to compare what you're seeing with the original virus, so you can see how it's mutating and adapting. And that's critical information, and they still haven't complied that. And remember, this started way back last year, and we're now into the spring, and they still haven't come clean.
Yeah, but why, across the globe, there's backlash. Obviously it's building against China. And last night, Trump did blame them for the contagion. But we have to punish, they have to pay for what they did so that this doesn't happen again. Do you believe in, suing or possibly reparations?
Well, I just think from a practical standpoint, reparations aren't likely to go very far. There's a long history of suing countries. Winds up in years in the court. Most of the time, nobody ever makes money on that. It works for countries because what you're really going to achieve there is not get money, because very rarely do you actually get money. But it works on countries that are already kind of deeply isolated. China isn't. So we actually already have something on the books called the Global Magnitsky Act, which allows the United States to go after individuals and governments for human rights abuses. And we already have enough credible information that right now we already have an instrument where we can start to go after the responsible Chinese leaders and hold them accountable. I think that's a much quicker route and much more likely to be effective in the short term. The other problem with the sovereign immunity is that there are things in law about what you can and can't do and everything. And I know there are people that want to change and broaden and open up the law for suing China, but none of that legislation is actually passed yet. So I think the Global Magnitsky Act in the near term is probably going to be a much more powerful instrument for hurting the Chinese.
Ann Applebaum, writing at The Atlantic, the rest of the world is laughing at Trump. Quoting her, in a world where people laugh at the American president, the Chinese might succeed. Inside the bubble of officials who surround Pompeo, it may well seem very brave and cutting edge to use the expression Wuhan virus or call for bigger and bolder rhetorical acts on China. But out there in the real world, out there in the world where Pompeo's boss is perceived as a sinister clown and Pompeo himself is just the sinister clown's lackey, not very many people are listening. Once again, a vacuum has opened up and the Chinese regime is leading the race to fill it.
Look, well, Ann's incredibly tone deaf on this issue, and
yes.
And she just hates the administration. It's blinded any sense of objectivity that she might have. So we have plenty of evidence that it's a real struggle out there between the United States and China on this. So, for example, the United Kingdom, which was going to allow Huawei, the telecom company, to build about 30% of their backbone infrastructure for their new 5G network, most people think the British are going to reverse that call, and because they're just so angry at the Chinese. There are many parts of the world where people are incredibly angry at the Chinese, and the Chinese, in response to that, have been aggressively going out, attacking the U.S. and offering people stuff. But look at Africa. We've got stories out of Africa, which has really been the Chinese playground for years now. One is stories in the African media about how appallingly Africans are treated in China. I mean, blatant racism, way worse than Jim Crow. And the other is the incredible that these African countries are, essentially on default because of their economic problems. The Chinese aren't doing loan forgiveness. The Chinese are seizing state assets. So I think Ann's just completely wrong on this. There's a real struggle out there. And if the United States had been silent, that would have been like a giant green light to China to just roll over everything. I just think she's completely off base.
Well, and I that's why I want to people have to hear from the internationalist intelligentsia, such as it is, because I mean the rhetoric coming from the Ann Applebaums and Ian Bremmer, which I'm about to get to, is very reminiscent of the I'm not covering for the Soviet Union. I'm not promoting the Soviet Union. I'm just saying, that Ronald Reagan is a clown and the Soviet Union is rushing to fill the gap in international leadership. Ian Bremmer writing this: China is braced for the fact that no matter who wins or loses in November, bipartisan hawkishness against China is going to be a factor in Washington for some time to come. That being the case, most officials in China privately say they'd prefer an anti-China president in Trump's style, divisive, unilateral, dismissive of allies, than in the mold of Joe Biden. China wants Trump to get reelected, says Ian Bremmer in Time.
Yeah, I love Ian. He's a great friend. But again, what's his evidence for that? I mean, he writes that. Who in the Chinese government has he actually talked to? And did they just candidly tell him exactly what they're thinking? I mean, I think we just have to ask the common sense question is no American president has ever pushed back on China for like 20 years in a serious way. The president really squeezed them on a trade deal. He's come after them in the South China Sea. He's doubled down on support for Taiwan. He's done everything the Chinese absolutely hate, and yet that's the guy they would prefer. It's just like, we went through the same thing with Russia, where this administration has had the toughest Russia policy for decades. And you could go through policy after policy after policy where the Americans are building up NATO and are tough on Russia, and yet the narrative from the critics is, the president's just a pawn of Putin. So, when they repeat the same narrative, regardless of what the situation is, you just kind of wonder what's going on here. It's like the old SNL Coke and Pepsi, skit, where, it doesn't matter if the sign on the machine is Coke or Pepsi. People say the same thing. So it's just difficult to take it as a credible, reasonable view that's expressed and not just kind of partisan hackery.
He is Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Jim, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you. You guys make my Monday awesome. I so appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Investment advisory services offered through Sound Income Strategies, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisory firm. Have you been putting off opening your retirement account statements because you're afraid of what you might see? If you were caught in the recent correction, you know that watching your savings evaporate in the market is devastating. We're the Retirement Income Store, and our message is clear.